So today I'm going to show you how to go from this to this. I'm going to show you how I used leftover materials from building my garage to put together this garbage can enclosure. So just to show you, it has a lid that can lift. That way when you lift up the lid, you can access the garbage cans to throw garbage in there. When the lid is closed, to remove the actual bins, we unlock this latch here. And as you can see, there's nice easy access to pull the bins out for garbage day. Should keep it nice and watertight and should keep the raccoons out. So as you can see here, we have a garbage can enclosure that's kind of fallen apart. It's starting to rot, it's starting to sag. The front door is really loose, so anytime the wind blows, the door blows back and forth and makes a lot of noise. Right now it's really calm out, but anytime there's a rainstorm or a windstorm, that door is constantly shaking back and forth. And the other door here on the other side completely broke off. So it doesn't even stay on anymore. So now that we've got the old one out of the way, the first thing I did was sweep up to clean up a little bit here. This concrete slab here is not even close to level. As you can see on this spirit level, the bubble is not even close to being inside the lines. However, when I do set the level straight, as you can see there's a couple of inches gap on the other side of the concrete pad. But no problem. What we're going to do is we're going to put the taller bin to that side and we're going to make it relatively level. The pressure treated lumber that we have here was left over from when we built this garage. Whenever you put up a new structure, any of the wood that makes direct contact with the concrete slab has to be pressure treated. So what we have here is some 2x2, and this isn't actually a regular dimensional lumber. This is the end of some pieces of 2x10 that we ripped down to make them fit for some wall plates when we were building the garage. So this isn't a size that you'll likely find in Home Depot or any of the lumber yards. However, it's what we have a lot left over. Now keep in mind, anytime you cut through pressure treated wood, whatever end that you expose has to be sealed. So what I have is some leftover sealer that we had from the fence back there that we're going to use to seal the cut edge once we're done. And it looks like it is about 2 inches. So we will set the table saw to rip the pressure treated 2 inches. So I've finished ripping down the first piece, and what we'll do next is we'll put the bins back and we'll measure how long and how wide this enclosure is going to be. So we'll say, will 30 work? Let's check the other side. And it looks like 30 will work. Just like that. I'll use my speed square in order to mark the line at 30. Okay, so for the next piece we'll cut it at 67 inches for the back wall. Okay, so now we'll make sure that the pieces are an even distance from each other and that the whole thing is square. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be doing is adding some temporary fasteners to hold these bottom plates in place while we build the frame. What I'm going to do for now is I'm going to use plastic anchors that are usually used for drywall. We're going to use these zinc coated screws. So now I'm going to switch to the masonry bit. Make sure it's set to the hammer function. Okay, now we'll set our anchors. these up, and I will drill. So the first thing we're going to build is this side of the enclosure. And since we confirmed that about 36.5 is the height of the blue bin, and we wanted to add some extra space, we're going to make a wall that is 38 inches tall. So we're going to make a frame of 3 pieces of 38, 3 studs, and then one across the top that is the same length as this bottom plate. Mark the 1.5 inch mark. And make a line with your square, put an X for where the stud goes. Now we're going to measure halfway. Since these pieces are 30 long, 15 is the halfway point, and since these are each 1.5 inches wide, half of 1.5 is 3/4. So instead of doing 15, we'll do 14 and 1/4. We'll go from 15, we'll back up 3/4. We'll mark it with our square. Put the X for where we want the studs, and the same thing on the last piece. Mark the 1.5 inch mark for the stud, and draw it with a pencil, just like that. Mark it with an X, and now it's time to put it together. Again, using the mark that we made before, make sure the 2 pieces are flush. Get the screw started. Make sure it's nice and flush. Just like so. I used some 2x4s, so I felt these would be a little bit stronger to be able to support the weight of the lid as it opens and closes. And at the back, I went ahead and I used an extra 2x10 that I had lying around. And I've secured it partially, anyway, to the back of the structure to create the slope that will allow for the roof to drain and for the lid to drain. So what we're going to do next is we're going to cut some crossbars. They're going to brace this 2x10 over to the front. And once the crossbars are cut and installed, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install some plywood on the faces of the walls, and we'll start building the doors. Okay, so the way that I like to mark out more complicated cuts like this is, instead of trying to measure each individual section and doing math with angles and triangles, I find it's easier if you have a scrap piece, which I do here, this piece of 2x4. If you just line it up with exactly where you want it to be, we're going to brace it right inside here. You can use a pencil to then scribe where you want to make your cuts. Just like that. And like that. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so I'm using a drywall T-square to make the marks for where I'm going to cut. So I've got my skill saw, and I've got it set to cut plywood. You can do that by adjusting this here. I'll set it to 3/4, lock it, and we're ready to cut. So what we're going to do first is we're going to apply some sheathing tape. And we're going to wrap it around the bottom of the wood so that it's nice and protected from any water wicking up. So what I've got here is something called tuck tape. This is the sheathing tape we're going to be applying. Okay, now that this side is done and all screwed on, we're going to move to the other side and cut the other piece of plywood. So what I've done at this point is I've removed the enclosure from its base. That way I can get access to the back to put the back plywood on. Okay, so at this point you can see I've got all the plywood on the back of the enclosure. And what we'll also do is we'll get the house wrap out, and I'll show you how to put on the house wrap and the siding. So I went and brought out the house wrap that we're going to be using around the sides, below the siding. And I've unrolled it on our enclosure here. Because the roll is so wide, this is a 9-foot roll. It's made for putting up on walls on houses or on structures like this garage. What we're going to do is we're going to unroll it to the length that we need. We'll patch some of these holes with some tape, and then we'll staple it down. So I'll show you how to do that. So the brand we're working with here is called Tyvek. It's one of the most common house wrap brands that you see on the market. And on Tyvek, they put these red markings to show where it needs to be stapled. And you can either use a regular stapler, like this, which is nice and easy because it's on a flat deck, or you can use a hammer stapler, which is the ones where you hammer and it sends a staple every time you hit it against the wood. I personally prefer using the hand staplers like this, because I find that with the hammer staplers, it tends to put a hole anytime the hammer contacts the house wrap. So I've finished stapling and taping down the house wrap here, and as you can see I made sure it was pressed nice and tight up against the house wrap, that way no water can get into the seam. So I've got a piece of the corner material out here, and as you can see inside the corners there's 3/4 inches of space for the siding to fit inside. The way these go on is they get cut to length on the corner here from end to end, and if you have a building that's directly on the ground or close to it like here, you try to make the siding hover just above ground contact. It doesn't have to actually be touching, but it should be pretty close to get a nice look. So we'll measure the length, we'll mark it on the corner, and then we'll cut it. So for the first side, we have 53 3/4, which I'll mark on the siding here. And I'll use my speed square to make a straight line across. And then to cut the vinyl siding, you can either use aviation cutters, aviation shears, which are made for cutting sheet metal, or you can use purpose-made vinyl siding cutters. I like these a little bit better just because they're a little bit longer and straighter. It's easier to control the cut. So go ahead and make a cut. Just like that. And I'll do the same on the other side. Now another way that you can cut vinyl siding is by using a miter saw and turning the blade backwards. The heat generated by the blade of the miter saw will cut it very straight. However, because at the top of this enclosure the cut is not straight, I'm going to do it with these shears. What I like about most vinyl siding is that once you've got 3 sides cut, you can turn it like this. You can get a nice straight cut. Just like that. So for actually installing vinyl siding, what a lot of people like to use are roofing nails, just like this, the 1.5, 1.25 inch roofing nails. And these are great if you have studs to secure to, which in this section we do because there is material behind the corners. However, I find that even when building full-size structures like the garage here, a lot of times the holes inside the slots of the vinyl will not line up with the stud locations, or the stud location will be right on the edge of a slot like that. And the whole purpose of these slots is to allow for expansion and contraction. Whenever you install vinyl siding, you're aiming to have your fasteners right in the middle. And when you press them in to the vinyl, you want to leave about a 16th or a 32nd of an inch of space in between the vinyl and the fastener to allow for that expansion and contraction. You don't want it super tight to the point where it's pulling the material into the wall. You want just a little bit of separation, just like that. What I personally prefer to use instead of the galvanized roofing nails are stainless steel screws. And since I usually use 1/2 inch sheathing, like we did in this case, I usually get 8 by 1.5. And these screws are just the perfect size, the pan heads, to fit inside the slot and to still have some play so that it can allow for the expansion and contraction. So I prefer to use these. And when you install fasteners in vinyl siding, you want them every 10 slots, which puts it 16 on center. So I got the other corner installed, and what we're going to do now is put on the bottom section. Now initially I had wanted to use starter strip, and we'll use that for the sides of the enclosure, but the issue is since the back wall is not level, if we put the starter strip on, the vinyl has to clip into the starter strip, which will make the entirety of the siding on the back of the enclosure at a level. But we want it to be level, so what we're going to do instead is we're going to use some J-channel, and we're going to drill lots of holes to let the water drain out. So I'll get the J-channel, we'll measure the distance between the two corners, and then we'll install it. So I've got the bottom J-channel on now. What the measurement was from corner to corner was 68, but anytime you install vinyl siding, they want you to leave about a 1/4 inch gap between any pieces of trim or any pieces of siding to allow for an expansion and contraction. If you don't leave that gap, when the weather heats up, it's only about 10 degrees Celsius today, the vinyl could expand and it will buckle. So what you need to do is allow that 1/4 inch gap on each side. So instead of cutting at 68, I cut at 67.5 to allow a 1/4 on each side. The next thing I'm going to do is drill some holes on the bottom of this J-channel for drainage, and we'll figure out the first course of siding. So the next thing I've done is mark a line at 43 inches from the top of the enclosure. And the way I arrived at that number was because each piece of vinyl siding is about 10.5 inches tall to the top of the actual nailing strip. So if I measure 10.5 right about here, you can see that's 10.5 from the very bottom of the J-trim. We leave an extra 1/4 inch for expansion and contraction, which puts us at 10 3/4. So 10.5 is the full size of the vinyl siding. Now in order to keep it level, I measured how far down that was from the top of the enclosure, which ended up being about 43 inches. So I've marked 43 inches all the way across, so I know where to set the siding to be level. Now what I have to do is measure this distance from the bottom of the J-channel to the line, which is 7 3/4, and we'll reduce that by a 1/4 inch to 7.5. And I'll have to cut down my vinyl siding to fit. The first thing we're going to do, however, is measure from corner to corner and figure out how long our first piece of siding needs to be. Now that I have the piece cut to the width of the enclosure, I have to cut down one side to be able to fit in the J-channel. So I'll do that now. So now that I've got it cut, let's turn it over and let's slide it in and see how we did. And overall, I'd say that went in pretty well. Lines up quite well with the line, and there's lots of space in here for the reveal. We'll lift this side up. We'll also make sure that we have enough space side to side, so I'll push it to the extreme on this side and pull it back just a 1/4 inch to give it that expansion and contraction gap. And then we'll screw it in. So I've now got the first section of the vinyl siding installed. Once again, every 16 inches on center, putting a screw, not making it completely tight, allowing a little bit of space for expansion and contraction. So now that we're reaching the top of the enclosure, what we have to do is install our top J channel. So I'll put the J channel across, again leaving a 1/4 inch on each side for expansion and contraction. So I finished up the last section of the vinyl siding here, and we're about ready to stand up the enclosure. Now that the back section is done, we can stand it up where it's supposed to sit, because we no longer need access to the back wall. At this point, I put most of the siding on, and I cut a lid to put on top of the enclosure out of 1/2 inch plywood. We're going to put shingles down. So I've installed the first row of shingles, and they're turned upside down to form a starter strip. And the reason for that is because you need to cover the slot that's left in between the tabs so that bare plywood isn't exposed. The next course goes on top, and it obviously overlaps that slot. Now if we were doing this on an actual building, we'd want to have the starter strip run all the way up the sides as well. But because this is an enclosure, and we're not as worried about waterproofing it, we're going to save some material by not doing so. I've driven the screws, normally you would use roofing nails, right into the center of this tar strip, just like we'll be doing on the next piece. And the reason for that is that the tar covers the entire head of the screw, or in most cases the nail, to form a waterproof seal. So I'm using 3-tab shingles, and 3-tab shingles have this convenient feature where they cut a slot in the side of the shingle that allows you to line it up with the next course without having to measure. It ensures a straight line down the entire roof, or in this case the lid, without having to measure off the top of the roof for the lid every single time. So I'll use these tabs. On a normal roof, I'd be overlapping these halfway through the course, so the middle of this shingle would line up with this groove. But because the lid is just about the perfect size to have 2 pieces of shingle, we'll keep it like this. Thanks everyone for watching the video. Make sure to like and subscribe to see more projects like this.